President Donald Trump said that the United States will impose 35% tariffs on Canada. Starting next month, he also planned to impose blanket tariffs of 15% or 20% on most of his other trade partners. In a letter released on his social media platform, Trump told Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that the new rate would go into effect from 1st of August and would go up if Canada retaliated. He did place a condition, though, saying that if Canada acted on the fentanyl menace in the country, then perhaps these tariffs could go down. Trump has also broadened his trade war in the recent days, setting new tariffs on a number of countries. That includes his own allies, Japan and South Korea, along with 50% tariffs on copper. Interestingly, US President Donald Trump has announced 50% tariffs on Brazilian imports. This as he accused the country's leftist leadership of orchestrating a witch hunt against the former Brazilian president, also his right-wing ally, Jair Bolsonaro. Now remember, the BRICS summit that recently concluded in Brazil also condemned Donald Trump's rising tariffs and the airstrikes on Iran. And that has, of course, riled up the US president, who announced 50% tariffs on Brazil. Of course, the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, has hit back at the US president. But members China, Russia and India, of course, refrained from hitting back. Lula da Silva, of course, took it upon himself to defend the sovereign nature of BRICS governments, that they do not want an emperor on the internet slapping tariffs. Listen in to what Sanjay Suri has to say.
Something seems to have snapped, Akanksha, quite late to have then stalled the announcement of at least some sort of a mini trade deal with the US that had been expected widely. President Trump, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent were saying over the last weekend and later that an announcement is due very soon. And then suddenly we saw brakes applied, if not the guillotine fall. And why? Well, the deal may have run into a BRICS wall. We had a declaration from BRICS condemning coercive tariffs and supporting strengthening of their currencies, if not quite aiming to dethrone the dollar. That not said in so many words anyhow, and an agreement to raise trading within the bloc. And all this couldn't have sat sweetly with the announcement of a trade deal with India, a major BRICS member. Trump threatened a 10% tariff for anything anti-American from BRICS, even perhaps just for being a BRICS member. But talks between India and the US do continue nevertheless. India has not received one of those nasty letters, and there is time till August the 1st at least for some sort of limited deal to be reached, and an Indian team is expected to visit Washington again to take talks further. The brick walls in the way really are agriculture and the auto industry. The US wants unimpeded access or near unimpeded access in both, and India cannot have that, not to the extent the US wants. The survival of millions of farmers in India is at stake. The survival of India's auto industry itself is at stake. One has to say the survival of the government too. Giving in fully to US demands would be economic and electoral suicide. India is prepared for some calibrated concessions, but Trump is an all or nothing man, ideally all for himself, nothing for others, and he can add to the all he wants at will. So ultimately, away from the nuts and bolts, the challenge for India is to find a way to mood-proof any agreement that may be reached.
BRICS is not, in my opinion, not a serious threat. But what they're trying to do is destroy the dollar so that another country can take over and be the standard. And we're not going to lose the standard.
Is Donald Trump afraid of BRICS? And why so? Because the US president has now vowed to slap an additional 10% tariff on any nation backing the anti-American policies of the BRICS. Donald Trump has vowed higher tariffs on BRICS nations that align with the bloc's plans to challenge US hegemony. The initiative, meant to be a counterweight to G7, has dozens of nations still eager to join. In fact, Trump is doubling down against the BRICS bloc of fast-growing economies. This includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the deal maker has warned that their push to undermine the US dollar's dominance has threatened America's economic supremacy. The BRICS leaders convened in Rio de Janeiro for their annual summit on Sunday. All of this further piling pressure on top of existing and threatened trade levies. The timing was interesting as Trump administration's 90-day pause on higher tariffs expires. Letters have also been sent to inform dozens of countries of their new US import levy. Now, the BRICS response to Trump's 10% tariff threat has been swift and firm. Brazil's President Lula da Silva called it very mistaken and very irresponsible. The world has changed. We don't want an emperor. We are sovereign countries. That's what the Brazilian president had to say. In fact, the joint statement by BRICS leaders, including Prime Minister Modi, said, and let me quote, "We voice serious concerns about the rise of unilateral tariff and non-tariff measures which distort trade and are inconsistent with WTO rules." Even though the statement didn't directly name US, it included more references to the increasing use of tariffs in global trade. Now let's switch gears to what the US president is claiming, that the BRICS is not a serious threat in his opinion. But what's interesting is his threat perception is based on the BRICS' ability to degenerate the dollar. Let's try and deep dive into whether this is actually a strategy or more of an ideology for the United States as far as Trump's tariffs are concerned. And to do that, I'm joined in by our guest today, Matthew Maguire, who is the former US Treasury advisor, joins us live. Many thanks to you, Mr. Maguire, for joining in. You've said that Trump's tariffs are an old playbook with proven downsides, as we've seen in the previous Trump presidency. But many economists believe that they are worse than his previous presidency. What's your view and why so?
Yes, I think this is the very issue with President Trump, is that he used tariffs in his first term and it didn't work particularly well. And now he's going so much bigger. And ultimately, these are just taxes on American businesses. So why the Trump administration seems to think that taxing American businesses is going to change our trade relations is a very hard thing to get our heads around.
You've often referred to a failed history of tariffs in the 20th century America to support your argument. Why do you believe it will eventually hurt the American economy, and why do you give example of what history has stated for America?
It's hurting the American economy right now. There are two things I would point to. First of all, we had a growing economy in the fourth quarter of 2024, grew about 2.5%. In the first quarter of this year, under the Trump administration, our economy shrunk by 0.5%. It was that quick. So clearly these tariffs are scaring an awful lot of business leaders, and it's changing our economy. But more specifically, what happens when we put tariffs up is other countries have countermeasures. So soybeans, for example, we used to sell an awful lot of soybeans. About a third of all of our soybeans went to China. After the Trump first tariffs, that went down to about 25%, and we've never regained the market share with China because they just started buying from Brazil and from other countries. And so we're seeing this in real time. It is harming our economy right now.
You've said that President Trump's economic strategy boils down to three key pillars and that none of them are growth strategies. Why do you say so?
Well, as I said, we've already seen some of the impacts. Our economy has contracted in the first quarter, and we'll see what the second quarter numbers look like. But consumer sentiment is down. Businesses are not investing because they don't know how to plan for what's coming and so on. But really, if you look at the three things that President Trump has done, none of them encourage growth. The first is shrinking government. Well, the federal government's about a quarter of our economy. So if you cut that, that's obviously contractive. The second thing are these tariffs that he's using. Those are taxes on American businesses. Increasing taxes on American businesses does not grow our economy. And then the third thing, which is very worrying, is all of the decisions seem to be coming directly from one person, the president. And the case that I would make is, historically, that just doesn't work. The more centralized an economy is, the more difficult it is to be dynamic and innovative and to grow. And right now, everyone's just watching the White House to see what's going to happen next. And so it makes businesses sit on their hands. It's not a good way to grow our economy.